now. Okay, so our speaker today doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I'll provide one anyway. Peter Bergen is the Vice President, Director of Studies and Fellows Programs in the International Security Program at New America. He's a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University as well, and he teaches courses in our online MA in Global Security on Terrorism and the Future of War. Peter is the author of several very powerful books, including Manhunt, the 10-year search for bin Laden from 9/11 to Abbottabad, and The Longest War, the enduring conflict between America and Al-Qaeda, Holy War Inc., Inside the World of Bin Laden, all of which have been New York Times bestsellers, translated into multiple languages and listed as among the best fiction books by the Washington Post, The Guardian, Amazon, Foreign Policy, and others. HBO turned Manhunt into a film that won an Emmy for Best Documentary, and CNN used a prior book, Osama bin Laden, The Osama bin Laden I Know, An Oral History of Al-Qaeda's Leader, a film that was nominated for an Emmy and named the Best Documentary in 2006 by the Society of Professional Journalists. You probably know Peter is a national security analyst at CNN, has written extensively about Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Pakistan, counterterrorism, homeland security, and the Middle East for a host of media outlets. We'll talk a little bit more about his current work on the COVID Daily Brief here towards the end of today's presentation. Today, he's going to be discussing his newest book, Trump and His Generals, The Cost of Chaos. The book has already received extensive critical acclaim, and based upon the fact that Peter has already spoken on this book here at ASU once before, and we have an audience of this size, speaks to the generalized, that was intended pun, interest in the topic. Peter, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Professor Kubiak. So, you know, I finished, the book got published in December. Obviously, the coronavirus kind of catastrophe hadn't happened. But the book, I think, does provide a little bit of background about how we got to where we are. President Trump is the first American president in history who had neither served in the military nor served in public office. And one of the big questions coming into during the campaign was, how would he be as commander-in-chief? And Steve Bannon said to candidate Trump, you know, we have to kind of assuage people on the commander-in-chief question, because Hillary Clinton seemed to be, people didn't have a problem seeing her in the commander-in-chief role because she'd served as Secretary of State, she'd served on the Senate Armed Services Committee, she'd been a senator from New York. And so this was an issue that Steve Bannon certainly thought was important for President Trump to kind of, candidate Trump to kind of position himself as a potential commander-in-chief. And one of the ways he did that, of course, was by bringing Mike Flynn, a three-star retired general, to play a key role in the campaign. And General Flynn wasn't, was obviously a decorated veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, had run the Defense Intelligence Agency. And so I think he played a very important role in the campaign, because if somebody at his level was sort of endorsing Trump, for a lot of voters, that was enough. And of course, when Mike Flynn became National Security Advisor, that only lasted 24 days, and H.R. McMaster took over. So one of the themes of the book is the generals who served under President Trump, particularly in the first couple of years. They are, of course, H.R. McMaster, John Kelly, Jim Mattis. And what is interesting about all of them is none of them knew President Donald Trump at all when he was campaigning, had never met him. John Kelly has actually said that not only did he not know Donald Trump, he didn't know anybody who knew Trump. So these were coming from completely different ecosystems. And the reason for that, in part, I think, is because of the whole Never Trump movement. You know, in a typical administration, there'd be 200 or 300 people who are, you know, going to be the assistant secretaries of X or Y. But that group of people had largely kind of, in a sense, by signing two Never Trump letters, about 150 leading Republican national security officials or Republican national security thinkers, by signing these letters, they basically dealt themselves out of consideration for any role in the Trump administration. And some of the people that signed those letters included Fran Townsend, who was Homeland Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, Mike Chertoff, who was Secretary of Homeland Security for George W. Bush, Mike Hayden, who'd been CIA director for George W. Bush. I mean, there were some pretty big heavy hitters who essentially dealt themselves out of consideration, which meant that the uniformed military or recently retired 4-stars were kind of a natural place for Trump to look for people with experience, because he needed people who understood how the national security apparatus ran. And his first choice, one of the stories in the book was for Secretary of Defense, wasn't Jim Mattis. In fact, Jim Mattis was his third choice. His first choice was Stan McChrystal, which isn't that surprising, given General McChrystal's record as Joint Special Operations Command, also his close friendship with Mike Flynn, who was really running the, during the transition, was effectively in charge of the national security portfolio. And so on November 16th, 2016, General McChrystal was going up to New York City on the Acela and received a call from Trump Tower. And the gentleman on the other end said, we'd like you to come in to talk about being Secretary of Defense. And McChrystal said, well, I've been looking at the campaign. I just don't think I'm the right guy. And there was a kind of long pause at the other end of the line. And the Trump campaign official said, are you sure? Are you really sure you don't want to be considered? And General McChrystal said, yeah, that he was really sure he didn't want to be considered. And of course, later, about a year or so later, General McChrystal publicly denigrated the president for his on the question of his honesty and other character issues. So then the next candidate was General Jack Keane. And what's interesting about General Keane, of course, he'd been the Vice Army Chief. He played an important role with George W. Bush in persuading him to do the surge and persuading him to replace General Casey with General Petraeus at the beginning of the surge in very late 2006, early 2007. Now, Keane received a call from Vice President Pence, and he also turned down the job. His wife of many, many years, many decades, had suffered from Parkinson's for a long time and had recently died, and he just didn't feel that he was able to accept the job. And in fact, he was again offered the job when Jim Mattis resigned 2 years later, and again turned it down because of personal reasons. But Jack Keane has played an important behind-the-scenes role for this administration. He's one of the few people that Trump will treat as a peer. He's from Manhattan. He grew up in the projects in Manhattan, rose, to become the Vice Chief of the Army, 4-star general, imposing guy. He spent, often on Fox News. And he's one of the few people that Trump will listen to and actually will change his mind. So, for instance, when it came to withdrawing all American soldiers from Syria, which was the precipitation point for Jim Mattis to resign, it was Jack Keane who went into the Oval Office and talked to President Trump. And the way he communicated with Trump was to show him a map of Syria and show him where the oil fields are in Syria, and basically say, look, if we draw down to zero, the Iranians or ISIS or both will be able to seize these oil fields. So Keane is certainly somebody that Trump will listen to. And then the third choice, of course, was Jim Mattis. So when Jack Keane had turned down the job offer from President Trump, he was asked if Jim Mattis would be a good choice, and he said, of course, he would be. So Vice President Pence calls Jim Mattis in Washington State, where he's recently retired. Jim Mattis is volunteering at a soup kitchen and tells the Vice President-elect, I'm volunteering at a soup kitchen. Can I call you back? Which he then does. 2 days later, he goes to Bedminster in New Jersey, where Trump is spending a lot of time at one of his golf clubs, and they have a discussion and they disagree pretty profoundly about two issues, one of which they kind of resolve and the other one they don't resolve. The first issue is a question of, is it okay to torture terrorists, or is that the right approach? And Jim Mattis said, it was misreported at the time, that he says, well, what works with a terrorist is a cigarette and a glass of beer. Well, of course, he didn't say glass of beer because a jihadi terrorist wouldn't drink beer. What he said was a cigarette and a coffee. And rather than torturing somebody, it's better to build rapport if you want information. And Trump accepted that. On the campaign trail, he had talked about torturing terrorists. He talked about killing the families of terrorists. He talked about sending people to Guantanamo, and he's done none of those things. But the disagreement that would linger and fester and get bigger over time was the question of NATO. And Mattis's view is if NATO didn't exist, you'd have to invent something very similar. And in fact, the day that he became Secretary of Defense, his first phone calls were to his counterparts in England, in the UK, and in Canada, assuring them of the importance of the NATO alliance. So Jim Mattis comes on board, and then, of course, his close friend John Kelly comes on board. And for people in the White House, eventually, of course, John Kelly went from Department of Homeland Security to the White House, and some people always conceived of John Kelly as sort of Jim Mattis's deputy, because, of course, he had been Jim Mattis's deputy during the invasion of Baghdad in 2003. The leader, this two-star Marine general who led the Marines into Baghdad, was Jim Mattis, and the one-star general, he'd been a colonel, was then promoted to one-star, was John Kelly, his chief deputy. And then one of the leading colonels in this was Colonel Joe Dunford. So these three Marine generals have had the tightest of possible relationships going back 15 years before they started working, or a decade and a half before they started working for President Trump. And then, of course, you have H.R. McMaster coming in. He's brought in immediately after. There were three candidates at the time after Mike Flynn is forced to resign. One is Caslen, General Caslen, who being the superintendent at West Point, was the superintendent at West Point. John Bolton was in the mix, and then H.R. McMaster. And I think when H.R. McMaster came in, there was there was kind of a sigh of relief on the National Security Council staff. I have a scene in the book where Mike Flynn meets for the first and only time with the National Security Council staff, a couple of 100+ people, and is asked at a certain point, what does an America First strategy look like? And Mike Flynn says nothing, and it becomes painfully obvious to these senior civil servants in the room that he doesn't have an answer to this very basic question. Now, H.R. McMaster is a very different kind of thinker, leader, and talked about kind of grand strategy and China and Russia in his first discussion with the staff. Told the staff, not to produce 70-page briefing papers. That's not the way President Trump absorbs information. Told them to get everything onto an index card. Told them to suggest tweets for a particular policy. Held a very kind of, I think, a pretty conventional, in the best sense of the word, national security process modeled on Brent Scowcroft, which is, letting everybody air their positions and setting up, decisions for the president. And I think, he's only survived a little over a year as national security advisor when he was effectively forced out. Hundreds of White House staff lined the private street between the White House and the executive office, the Eisenhower office building across the street, and cheered him out and clapped him out, as it's known, which of course wasn't a feature for many of the senior Trump officials who were forced out before him or after him. And so I think HR was a genuinely popular national security advisor. And I think if you look at 2017, that was a relatively successful year on the foreign policy front for President Trump. There was the mid-April response to the use of of nerve agents by the Assad regime in Syria, a proportional response that was well coordinated. Frequent critics of President Trump, like Fareed Zakaria, publicly said this went very well, and it did sort of enforce the red line that President Obama had not enforced on the use of these kinds of weapons. And in fact, of course, the Trump administration responded again a year later in 2018 with a similar kind of response when again President Assad used these chemical weapons on his own people. There was also a very contentious, but I think ultimately somewhat fruitful, discussion of the Afghan War in the White House. On one side was Steve Bannon leading the kind of America First group inside the White House, and on the other side was H.R. McMaster, who had served in Afghanistan running an anti-corruption task force for more than 2 years. And H.R. McMaster felt very strongly that President Obama had made a big mistake when he gave his speech at West Point on December 1st, 2009, announcing the surge of troops into Afghanistan, but simultaneously also announcing their withdrawal date 18 months later. And I personally think that that was a mistake. It was sort of too clever by half. It was intended to kind of light a fire under the Afghan government. Instead, I think it just said to the Taliban, you can wait these guys out. It said to the Pakistanis, you can continue supporting the Taliban, continue your hedging strategy. It kind of undermined the Afghan government. And it wasn't, announcing withdrawal dates isn't a particularly smart idea. And so they, after a very contentious process in which a lot of other ideas were considered, President Obama, President Trump. Well, actually, let me just, since I mentioned President Obama, there are a lot of commonalities between President Obama and President Trump once you get past their rhetoric, particularly when it comes to the kind of the way that we're conducting operations against jihadist terrorists. Both of them saw themselves as getting elected to get out of America's foreign wars. And both of them approached it in roughly the same way, which is using special operations, special forces, using drones. It was really Obama who kind of really amped up the drone program in places like Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia. And so there were quite a lot of commonalities. And one of the commonalities is both presidents wanted to get out of Afghanistan. President Obama wanted to go down to zero in the sort of 2015 timeframe. But as his second term began to end, there was a lot of discussion about what to do in Afghanistan in the Situation Room. And ultimately, President Obama thought that it made sense to leave 8,500 troops there, which is kind of like was regarded as the minimal number to continue counterterrorism operations and maintain bases like Bagram Air Force Base. And so Trump comes into office again, feeling that he repeatedly would say things like we've wasted $6 trillion, and sometimes he'd say $8 trillion. And it's worth noting, of course, that a lot of that money that we talk about being spent on Afghanistan is really being spent on ourselves, we, the United States, because it pays for salaries of soldiers, it pays for contractors, it pays for companies doing business there. It's not like we did this massive transfer of wealth to the Afghan people, but we certainly spent a fair amount of money there. And a great deal of that money, of course, got consumed by corruption. So, and H.R. McMaster is keenly aware of that because he runs the anti-corruption task force for General Petraeus when he's the CENTCOM commander and also the Afghan theater commander. So HR doesn't want to announce withdrawals. He also wants a relatively small troop increase. Turns out to be about 4,000 soldiers. And there are some knockdown fights in the White House Situation Room between Steve Bannon and HR. Steve Bannon is intrigued by the idea of an Eric Prince proposal to essentially bring in retired special forces to fight, to spend long periods of times in particular parts of the country where they have experience. And I think Eric Prince actually had a pretty good diagnosis of what was wrong in Afghanistan, which is we keep fighting a new war every year with people who are not familiar with the place, and that it would be better if we had people returning to the same places again and again and again, which all makes sense. But the Pentagon, of course, was completely opposed to the idea of contractors not. It's one thing to have contractors doing meals or providing base security, but it's another thing for them to be involved in operations. So as far as the ground operations that would end up killing people, as far as the Pentagon was concerned, this was a non-starter. Eric Prince had a sort of answer for that, which was, okay, if we can make it essentially a CIA operation, and that way it's under the agency's aegis. The CIA didn't want any part of that. Mike Pompeo, of course, was director of the CIA at the time, but the CIA made it pretty clear to Pompeo that this was not a mission they wanted to take on. And so finally, there's a meeting at Camp David. In fact, it's just a day or two after Steve Bannon sort of fires himself after he gave an interview to the American Prospect, essentially saying that there was really no military solution for North Korea, which, the definition of a gaffe in Washington is telling the truth in public. And of course, this was certainly true. Any kind of military confrontation with North Koreans would likely be, a lot of people would end up dead. He was already out the door. August the 18th, 2017, he essentially is forced out. 2 days later, there's the meeting at Camp David. And at that meeting, the military presents, the NSC presents three options to the president. two of which are really non-starters. One is total withdrawal. The other is hand this thing over to the CIA, essentially. And the third is what President Trump ended up announcing at Fort Myer, which was, essentially stay the course, no withdrawal date, conditions-based, not time-based, and add more troops. So continuing on in 2017, we have Syria, we have the discussion of Afghanistan, and we remain in the Iran nuclear deal. The beginning of the end with when Mattis resigned in December 2018, that was a long time coming. There was a lot of disputes on substance and policy between President Trump and the generals who worked for him, and those really began adding up over time. One of them, of course, was Afghanistan. H.R. McMaster was really leading the charge on that, and I think lost a lot of political capital as a result. I quote somebody in the book that he took a lot of face shots for being the kind of the face of stay the course and don't withdraw and add troops in Afghanistan. But that was certainly also Jim Mattis's view and Rex Tillerson's view and John Kelly's view and General Dunford's view. It's just that it was HR who was really the kind of the spokesperson for that approach. And over time, obviously HR and the president didn't really have much of a personal connection or bond, but there were substantial disagreements on policy. A very early one was that both Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis took real exception to was the blockade of Qatar. Now, in 2017, there was, in May, there was Donald Trump's fairly successful trip to Saudi Arabia, where he spoke to 50-something Muslim-majority country leaders in Riyadh and gave a speech that was, basically, pretty reasonably well received. It could have been delivered by Obama, in fact, minus the Iran bashing. After the Saudis took that, they gave Trump the red carpet treatment, and they took it as sort of a acquiescence in their long plan to essentially blockade Qatar. And the origins of the dispute in Qatar go back into like some real family dynastic politics that most of us don't really understand. But the Saudi claimed that the Qataris were financing terrorist groups. Now, certainly there's been some history of Qatari financing of extremist groups, but nothing in the way that the Saudis portrayed it. And it was when the blockade began, President Trump just sort of tweeted out essentially Saudi talking points. And this completely blindsided Mattis and Tillerson, who were on a trip in Australia visiting their counterparts. Tillerson knew Qatar well because when he led Exxon, he had been the principal kind of negotiator with the Emir of Qatar about the largest natural gas field in the world, which is shared by Qatar and Iran. And Jim Mattis knew Qatar well because the most important base outside the United States, arguably a U.S. military base, is the forward headquarters of Central Command, which is in Al Udeid Air Force Base, which is in Qatar, home to 11,000 men and women in uniform, and which is from where the war against ISIS and also the Taliban was being conducted. And for Mattis and Tillerson, it just made no sense to blockade Qatar, which in many ways is a closer American ally with a huge American base. It has satellite campuses for universities like Georgetown and Carnegie Mellon and Northwestern, and Al Jazeera is at least a sort of relatively independent news organization that is based there. And they pushed back to no avail. Over time, I think President Trump realized that Saudis had sort of sold him a bill of goods, and in fact, the Qataris were not sort of the enemy of the United States. And over time, I think President Trump changed his mind about the Qataris, but by then it was too late. The blockade continues today. I think the Qataris have survived it, but it was the beginning of the end, I think, of Trump and Mattis's. It was the first really serious policy dispute they had. Those policy disputes continued. One was about transgender individuals serving in the U.S. military. Trump tweeted about it, sort of blindsiding Mattis, who'd had a 6-month review of that going. Trump's constant criticism of NATO allies, I think, began to wear thin on Jim Mattis and also H.R. McMaster and others, because after all, it was NATO that for the first time in its history invoked Article 5 after an attack on the United States. I have a great scene in the book where Angela Merkel makes her first visit to Washington to visit Trump, and Trump is very irritated that the Germans have not provided, are not spending 2% of their GDP on their military spending. And the way that Trump understands that, or at least pretends to understand it, or seems to understand it, is that somehow the Germans are ripping off the United States, when in fact the way that NATO works is each of the member countries contributes a relatively small amount of money, depending on the size of their budget, to the running of NATO, and then everybody spends a certain percentage of their GDP on their own defense spending, because it's a common defense pact, with the goal by 2024 of everyone spending at least 2% of GDP on their own defense. This is a commonly agreed goal. But for Trump, Trump treated Merkel like she was a tenant who was late on her rent. And he got his staff to draw up an invoice of the $600 billion that she supposedly owed the United States. And Angela Merkel was puzzled by this and sort of said, but you don't understand, this is not how this actually works. And over time, the disputes with NATO, of course, the Trump celebration of Putin was not something that was embraced by either Jim Mattis or H.R. McMaster, both of who oversaw the national defense strategy and the national security strategy, which identified Russia and China as peer competitors. And they, certainly Mattis publicly critiqued Putin at a speech at the Reagan Library a couple of weeks before he resigned. And certainly H.R. McMaster sealed his own fate when he publicly said at the Munich Security Conference, just after an indictment of 12 GRU military intelligence officers in Russia for their role in interfering in the U.S. election, that this proved that Russia had interfered in the election. Trump quickly tweeted criticism of McMaster, and basically, his days at the White House were numbered. And so over time, these generals who had served for under President Trump gradually either got pushed out early, resigned under pressure, or just left. And John Kelly left the White House pretty much around literally the same day that Jim Mattis left the Defense Department. And they're gone now, and they're replaced by, I think, a group of individuals who just are they're not of the same stature, and they're much less likely to disagree on policy and substance with the president. By the way, has anybody seen Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, in the middle of the most serious national security crisis, arguably since World War II? Mark Esper is certainly no Jim Mattis. The chief of staff in the White House is almost like a Trivial Pursuit question, because it's changed so often. And certainly Mark Meadows, I don't think is a John Kelly kind of character. So over time, I think that the quality of the people that have been working for President Trump has sort of declined, and basically he surrounded himself with a bunch of yes men, and they are almost invariably men. And of course, it's the president's prerogative to get the team that he wants, but is it smart to have a bunch of acolytes as opposed to a team of rivals? So I will leave it there, but there's much to cover. And
great, thanks. You have incredible access, and you've covered details that obviously we're not reading in the news. You have. Can you give us some insight as to kind of how that all comes about? I know you don't want to share all of it in detail, but I'm just super curious on.
Well, I've been living in DC since '92, and I have, my area of speciality is terrorism, but I've since 9/11 spent a lot of time with the U.S. military, embedded or otherwise. And just over time, I've got to know quite a lot of people, including people who worked in the worked in the Trump administration. I talked to about 100 people for the book. When you do an interview with somebody, it may end up as a sentence in the book. You don't really know what you're going to get.
Right.
And you're usually not doing these interviews on the phone. You're doing them in person because just for all sorts of reasons, you're going to get, people don't necessarily want to talk on the phone. this book would have been very hard to do in the present circumstance, I think, because I tended to meet people at, in a coffee shop somewhere. Obviously a lot of people have left the administration, that they're more inclined to talk. I tried also to be fair in the book. I mean, the book is, the title is Trump and His Generals, which is a pretty neutral title. The subtitle is The Cost of Chaos, which is a little bit less neutral. But I did try and do a book that was fair. And I mean, one of the things I'd say in the book, which I think the Trump administration has largely got right, leaving aside the coronavirus issue just for a second, is their approach to China. I think that they took a much more skeptical approach. There'd been this sort of view that the Chinese would kind of liberalize as their economy grew. Well, the reverse happened. They actually became more authoritarian as their economy grew. They had a lot more resources to throw in to their police state. And I think that the Trump administration correctly kind of recognized that. And, there's more freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea under the Trump administration. There's a lot more skepticism about issues like intellectual property theft and other issues. And I think that, broadly speaking, that's a big change, an important change, and it was a change that the Trump administration kind of implemented. Now, of course, the stakes about that question are even bigger, because we've really, wars can start because of the kinds of rhetoric that we're beginning to hear from both sides, and that would not. I mean, there's so many reasons why that would be a bad thing right now.
Right.
And even on the just having a bad relationship with the Chinese at a time, the two largest economies in the world need to kind of have a working relationship in order for us to get out of what looks like the Great Depression #2.
Well, the interesting piece to me is the two things here. One is the generals are all gone now. And you mentioned there's a lot of, they actually in a lot of ways brought stability, kind of a continuity from the previous administration, at least at some level, to the current administration. But now that they're all gone and we have some lesser actors, there are voices somewhere in the administration that are speaking to President Trump, and President Trump now seems to feel more free to exercise his own thinking on how to execute foreign policy. Where does foreign policy go? And are we in a better place today now that the generals are gone? Or what's your sense? And maybe the underlying question is, what's the cost of chaos?
Well, I think, we got out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership 5 days after Trump was elected, came into office. And I mean, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a really good response to how to help try and contain China.
There's talk of it re-emerging now. I was just reading the other day, right?
Interesting. Well, so that was a mistake, and that was just like, Trump sometimes just wants to just kill what Obama set up. The Iran nuclear deal, of course, that took a lot longer to get out of, and it's, Jim Mattis was asked in congressional testimony by Angus King, independent of Maine, if the deal was working. He said yes, because of course the deal was working. So one of the costs, is the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, there are many ways it could have been improved, but the whole point about deals is that it's not going to work out perfectly for both sides. And so the Iran nuclear, Iran is enriching uranium, not to any great high degree, reaching nuclear weapons level, but it is, it's kind of, so I think one of the costs is that foreign policy is less smart if you have less experienced people involved, and also that Trump can, to some degree, can just kind of do his own thing. One of the things about the generals, the reason they're not there is that they would have substantial disagreements about policy. And I'm not saying they were right all the time. I mean, they did bring a lot of experience. I mean, Jim Mattis had run Central Command, John Kelly had run Southern Command, H.R. McMaster had fought in the Iraq War and the Gulf War and in the Afghan War. These are very experienced people when it came to national security issues. They themselves, of course, had disagreements. I mean, Jim Mattis was very concerned that I think Jim Mattis thought that Trump was a loose cannon that needed to be managed. And so for instance, he would often say to people, we have to make sure that reason trumps impulse. And so much to the frustration of the White House, and I'll give an example of this in the book, Vice President Pence and H.R. McMaster asked for a war game to be held at Camp David in the fall of 2017, right at the time that tensions with the North Koreans were at their height. And Mattis simply refused to send war planners. And you can't have a war game if you don't have war planners. And on Iran, he would just slow roll things. And when they came to military planning on Syria, Mattis was very, very careful about not wanting to kill Iranians or Russians on the ground. And the fact is, we could take out, you're an Air Force retired colonel, and we could take the entire Syrian Air Force out in an afternoon and basically prevent them, doing all the terrible things they do to their own people, which is barrel bombing them and dropping chemical weapons. And I mean, we didn't do that. If you look at the first Syrian response was pretty, relatively small potatoes at the airfield where the first that attack was initiated from. So the responses in Syria were not. We didn't really go up the escalatory ladder with them, but we had nothing to fear,
right,
except of course embroiling the Russians or the Iranians in a broader war, which was Mattis's main fear.
For the audience, we have quite a good crowd, but nobody's sending in a question in the Q&A block. Nobody's got their hand raised. If you've got a question for Peter, just go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call on you and unmute your mic, and you can talk away. Otherwise, Peter and I'll just keep conversing. Let's see.
Okay, well, there's a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, there we go. Charlie Etheridge, a good MAGS grad, one of the first cohorts of MAGS students. Understand it's very difficult to predict the future, especially regarding complex global phenomena. Do you have any thoughts about how the pandemic might bear on security trends and events around the world going forward?
I do. In fact, Dan Rothenberg and I, who work with Jeff, are writing a piece for CNN that trying to answer some of that. I don't know if Charles recognizes the fact that he's actually quoting Yogi Berra, who famously,
right, yeah.
hard to make
I'm sure. I know Charles.
But I mean, one thing. I mean, there's kind of what will happen, and there's what should happen, and what will happen. I mean, I think a lot of the trends that are the most worrisome in the West are going to be increased. So Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, prime minister in Hungary, has accorded himself the right to rule by decree indefinitely. And 84 countries have declared states of emergency. The Chinese have used this moment to really crack down on the democracy movement in Hong Kong. So I think that these kind of authoritarian, nationalist, populist movements are going to just get stronger. And relations between China and the United States are going to get a lot worse. I mean, even if everything this is going to achieve what Donald Trump couldn't achieve, which is really our supply chains are going to change. I mean, pharmaceutical companies are going to pull back their operations into the United States, and we're going to be much less reliant on the Chinese. But that, and that makes sense. On the other hand, our relationship is, may sour as a result of some of that. And then you've got this bellicose rhetoric. So you can imagine a much worse kind of relationship with the Chinese and how that might play out. A much more nationalist, populist, authoritarian West, including in Russia potentially, and that's worrisome.
Yeah, and it empowers those very same groups within the countries too, right? I mean, we're going to have empowered populists here and in China, nationalists. All right, two more questions on the question and answer block. The first one says, please describe the differences between the general's management style and Trump's. So we're looking at kind of more specific.
Well, I mean, the difference in style, I mean, there's a great scene in the book that answers that question. So Steve Bannon very early on tells H.R. McMaster the following. He's trying to describe how Trump's kind of how he works. And basically, Steve Bannon tells H.R. McMaster, look, this is the guy who never did any homework. He never bought any of the books. He never did any of the coursework. He comes in he's out all late. He goes out partying all night. He comes in the morning. He grabs a big cup of coffee. He looks over your notes, and then does the minimum amount of work to kind of get the grade he needs on the test. And so this is really his style, which is he trusts his gut a lot. He doesn't do a lot of homework. He distrusts experts. He and I think, that none of that really mattered until this coronavirus crisis. Of course, it matters to some degree, but I mean, it really does matter if you don't trust experts. It really does matter if you trust your own gut in a situation where, there's some like scientific hard facts that need to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and of course, then there's a whole military code of honor. I mean, there's an astonishing scene in the book where there's a discussion of Afghanistan, and Trump says, the Afghan war wasn't worth the death of a single American soldier. And he says that as John Kelly's in the room. Now, John Kelly's son, Robert Kelly, had been killed by an IED in 2010 in Afghanistan. And so was Trump either not aware of that, forgotten it, didn't care, whatever. There's really no good explanation for that kind of thing. So the military has a kind of honor code that is, I think, quite different from the Trumps. But I also say in the book that we're not electing, when we elect our presidents, we're not electing people who are nice people. We're electing people who are going to defend our interests in all sorts of different ways. And, Richard Nixon was not a nice guy, but he opened up to China, creating probably the most successful economic partnership in history until recently. Bill Clinton had a sexual affair with an intern in the Oval Office, and there's a subnote in the book where Trump will give people tours of what he calls the Monica Room, which is a little room off the Oval Office. Bill Clinton lied about a sexual affair in the Oval Office with an intern to the American people, and yet he presided over at that time, the longest economic expansion in American history. So I think it's neither here nor there that Trump is not a gentleman in the military sense. And so I don't really kind of get into that too much in the book, because I think ultimately what the differences between Trump and the generals were not about kind of how they conducted themselves. It was really about the policy matters that they disagreed on.
Right. Good. Okay. A bunch of questions now in the Q&A block, so I'll just keep going in order. Next question says, how was President Trump's handling of our international partners impacted the abilities, or how has the President Trump's handling of our international partners impacted U.S.'s abilities to coordinate on foreign policy?
Well, I think, our relationship with NATO really suffered. And my guess, look, if Trump is a one-term president, I don't think the damage to our relations with our NATO allies is going to be that enormous. Even if Trump is a two-term president, I think that they've kind of come to an accommodation with President Trump. They don't really, they just understand, he's who he is. I don't. It's not like NATO, the alliance, has sort of collapsed as a result of President Trump. But I do think on the question on how to deal with the coronavirus, it does seem like it would need kind of global understandings, and Trump doesn't. That's not really where Trump's head is at. I mean, I think it's interesting, for instance, that New Zealand and Australia are talking about a kind of joint kind of travel bubble. Mm-hmm. And obviously both countries have done pretty well with the virus, but it's hard to imagine, will Trump do a similar deal with Canada, which would seem like the first step of reopening up international travel in some way? I think that's going to be harder because A, we have a bigger problem in the United States, and B, the way that he's treated Justin Trudeau, it's not like Justin Trudeau feels like I really owe President Trump something other than so I think it's not so much NATO. I think it's more the kind of international response to the coronavirus crisis that I think is maybe impacted by Trump's general sort of America First policy.
Okay. Next question. Do you see a larger role for the military and or the National Guard in mitigating public health and supply chain issues developing as a result of coronavirus? And do military leaders familiar to you endorse such a role? It's a very good question.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. And I mean, National Guard, there were National Guard units in many states helping and continue to help. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, I know there's and you know, the military, I mean, the military set up all these field hospitals, and yeah, I mean, the short answer, the military has a lot of capacity to do big things quickly. So I think the short answer is yes.
Is there a disconnect based upon the kind of history of the generals moving through the administration? Is there a disconnect? I mean, kind of assess the level of trust and ability for the DoD to be in the mind of the president and respond in ways that are complementary to the president's and the administration's approach to the virus.
You know, I think it's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. I did notice that Mark Esper early in the crisis kind of told commanders in the field not to talk publicly about what they were doing, and that seemed to me an overly politicized, like attempt just to kind of, you know,
Yeah,
downplay.
some bad biz during the carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt carrier issue.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting one because it still hasn't really been resolved.
Right.
Brent Crozier, the captain, you know, could be reinstated or he could not be, and it seems like General Milley is getting involved, and you know that's a pretty high level. You're the colonel retired. I mean, how often does a general, the chief of the army, how often does the overall chairman get involved to decide whether or not a particular somebody at the colonel captain level in the Navy, an 06, how often does that happen? I mean, it just doesn't. So it's clearly seen. This is something to do with not wanting to irritate Trump in some way.
Right.
It seems to me.
That's interesting. And actually, the follow-on, the next question in line, actually, so it's kind of follows along this questioning. I was at the beginning of the Trump presidency, I recall speculation that his reliance on a number of former U.S. military members for staff positions would shift U.S. civil relations. Now that we are in 2020, do you believe there are some long-term changes in the U.S. civil relations as a result of the Trump presidency?
I do. And I think it's been a long time coming. And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong. But I mean, so go back to Bill Clinton. When Admiral Crowe, who was the retired chairman, endorsed Bill Clinton, that was a seismic thing because retired military officers at the 4-star level had not done that, is my impression.
Mm-hmm.
And now you get the situation where, you know, 200, mostly 1-stars or 2-stars, like endorse Hillary Clinton or endorse Donald Trump. And there is, you know, whatever your views about Donald Trump, there is a kind of big erosion of the norm that, you know, particularly the retired 3 or 4 stars, you know, don't, and particularly retired 4 stars, really don't get involved in politics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at Admiral Mullen. He's really said very, very little since he's retired. Look at General Dempsey.
Yeah.
You know, and then on the other hand, you have Stan McChrystal, who's publicly criticizing Donald Trump. And you also have Admiral McRaven publicly criticizing Donald Trump. And so this, you know, and their critiques may be completely legit, and they're certainly strongly held. And but you know, when you zoom out further, there is a norm that has been busted here. But you know, Trump has busted a lot
among many. Yeah, I was just going to say that it's just one of them. The list is too long to list at this point.
Well, you know, one of the things that I wish what's so useful about these kinds of discussions is like you realize all the things you should have put in the book. And one of the things that I realized that, you know, we, the United States, have a written constitution, and we think of Britain as having an unwritten constitution, which is correct. But it turns out the United States has an unwritten constitution we weren't really aware of, which is the president won't attack the CIA, the FBI, the inspectors general. He won't attack the apparatus that kind of keeps the country afloat. And that norm isn't written in the Constitution and at all.
Right.
But it was part of our unwritten constitution, which I think we're now more aware of.
Yeah, right. All right, we got a couple minutes left. We got one hand up in the audience. So I'm going to let Kimberly talk. Kimberly, your mic should be on. Let's see. Unmute. Now your mic is on. No, it won't let me unmute you. You need to unmute yourself, maybe.
I think unmute yourself, maybe.
Yeah, so I'm trying. It says unmute on my side. I'm unmuting, but it won't happen, and I don't see Kimberly unmuting. Kimberly, when you get unmuted, you can talk. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to the Q&A block. I apologize for the technical difficulties. What do you think the current consensus is in the White House about traditional diplomacy under Pompeo and the use of ambassadors? Are there some generals who are more supportive of diplomatic actions than others?
Well, I mean, Mattis famously testified that, you know, basically, you know, essentially he'd have to buy a lot less bullets if this, you know, if
Right.
made the point that the State Department, you know, allows him to not get into wars. So I mean, you know, there's a kind of traditional understanding of, you know, the military has a good understanding of what the capabilities of the State Department is. I mean, you know, the opening scene in the book is in the tank at the Pentagon, where, you know, basically the America First versus the kind of so-called globalists had a 2-hour presentation to Trump in which essentially the America First has won. But the most of the people in the tank in the Pentagon shared the same view, whether it was Jim Mattis or Rex Tillerson or Gary Cohn, the chief economic advisor, that the rules-based international order that came out of World War II, basically that the United States had constructed, worked in America's favor. That is not the view of, was not the view of Steve Bannon or nor Donald Trump, who left the meeting kind of ebullient about how they had basically, you know, kind of quashed the whole idea that this was a good thing, that the United States should lead, and you know, really what Trump campaigned on is kind of how he's governed.
All right, so we got about 5 minutes left, and I promised Peter actually a couple minutes. Actually, I wanted to challenge you to you write this daily COVID daily brief. I know you get up early every morning and crank out that piece. I get a lot of newsletters every morning from a whole host of different sources. The only one I actually read cover to cover is yours. It's outstanding. It's in the same tone that you talk today. Very balanced, very objective, and very fact based, which is very useful today. So I appreciate it. But give me your sense of where that's taking you
well, you know, the crisis happened, and we had run something called the South Asia Brief on foreign policy for 7 years. So myself and my team had a lot of experience about doing these things, and you know, you do have to get up early to do it because we like to release it at 8:30. One of our team lives in Berlin, so that's very helpful because she's 6 hours ahead. We have an ASU student in Dan Rothenberg's my class who's a bioscience person who helps us do some of the research. We have 3 people in Washington, one of whom has a PhD in the history of science, which is quite helpful, and 2 people in DC, one of whom tends to focus on politics, another on who focus on health issues, and then we also have an intern from SAIS who's kind of quite good on economics. Because you know, the point is right now there is a tsunami of stories. I mean, it's just like, this is the biggest news story in my lifetime, and you know, easily bigger than 9/11, because 9/11 was a sort of one-time event. And so just trying to like absorb all this information is you need a fair number of people and some smart people. But thanks for reading it, Jeff, and anybody on this call who's interested. It's the Coronavirus Daily Brief. It's put out by ASU and New America, and we try and make it usually averages about 6,000 to 7,000 words a day. Essentially, what are the most important and interesting stories? And we lead with health and science, which I think helps distinguish it a bit from some of the other, because there's so much on TV about the politics around this, but ultimately this is a health and science question. And you know, there's some promising things on the science side, even if you take a pretty skeptical view of you know, much that's happening on the political side. But my wife says it should come with a health warning, this daily brief, because usually it's pretty depressing.
Yeah, well, it is only from the standpoint that, like I said, it contains only facts, and there's nobody out there trying to push an agenda and push something that's. I mean, the reality of it is, quite frankly, once you get adjusted to the new normal, it just becomes the new normal, right? And so I think the newsletter does a really nice job of getting folks kind of caged into the normal.
Let me ask you a question, Jeff, which is, do you think, and there are quite a lot of people who are involved in the military, is my guess on this call. I mean, do you think if you served in the U.S. military, in a sense, you have more resilience to this kind of thing because you're used to like bad shit happening and, you know, having to, you know, adapt to strange situations all the time?
Yeah, I don't know that I can answer for the whole culture because I spent my entire adult life in that culture, and so I don't have any other frame of reference. I don't have a different frame of reference besides maybe watching my wife and her friends or whatever talking about this being slightly different than I am. Yeah, that's a difficult question. It really is. I think there's a certain amount of like I said, kind of social norming, if you will, of some of the crazy stuff that has to happen in a public health crisis like this, that will eventually come to be slightly more normal. And that's kind of my approach. My approach is, look, things are going to be different, but they're not going to be impossible. The human spirit, the human society itself they're all pretty resilient, you know, and there are going to be a lot of folks suffering a lot. I understand that, and we should all be sensitive to that. But, you know, this probably won't end the world. We have other ways we'll probably end up doing that as a human species over the course of our existence on this planet. But, oh, look, we have visitors, Peter, right behind you. You got a couple of visitors.
Yeah, this is the extraction team.
Well,
thank you very much for tuning in.
I think that's the perfect way to end, actually. I want to thank you, Peter, for taking the time. This has been fantastic. It's been great to hear. Your book is fantastic. Your insights are always welcome, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Professor Kubiak.
All right, for the rest of the audience, thank you for joining us. The video will be available for the MAG students, will be available on the MAG's Canvas site after we're done, and for everyone else, hopefully it will be available on the Center on the Future of War's website. Thanks, Peter. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.